Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, I want to welcome Etienne de la Boetie. He's an author, founder of the Art of Liberty Foundation, which exposes the illegitimacy and criminality of government and the hidden curriculum of organized crimes, mandatory government schools, scouting programs, and police and military training. Etienne, how you doing tonight?
I'm fantastic, Chris. Good to be with you and your audience.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. You know, there's so much that we could talk about. Your book covers some amazing truths that, you know, people should hear. Now, first, I'd like to start out with your pen name. Tell us how you came up with that. I know it's originally a 16th century writer from France. Tell us how you chose that pen name, and then what got you started down this path.
Well, sure. I'll start out by giving your audience kind of like an overview that I'm a voluntarist, and a voluntarist is someone that does not believe in the legitimacy, the desirability, or the necessity of having a government. And so the thesis of the book really is that government is illegitimate because if I don't have the right to steal your money and call it taxes, if I don't have the right to make up rules for you and call it laws, myself personally, for Chris, then I cannot delegate a right that I do not have myself to a representative or to a government. And so if the government did not get the right to do all the things that it did from we the people, since we the people cannot delegate rights they do not have themselves, then government is essentially illegitimate on its face. There is no election, there is no coronation that can give one man the ability to rule or use violence morally on other men. And so what the thesis of the book really is that government was never designed to protect life, liberty, and property, but it was always designed to kind of rob and enslave men. And the subtitle of the book, Understanding Our Slavery, is how organized crime runs the government and the media. And what I do in the book is I break down a kind of partnership between the rulers and the media, where the media for centuries has been propagandizing the population that it's legitimate that they get ruled, and it's legitimate that they get to steal your money and make up laws and boss you around. But if you really unwrap it, if you take a look at the morality of government, if you take a look at is it logical, is it moral, it really kind of like falls apart, but they get away with it because they're controlling perception, and they're controlling perception by controlling the information you receive by putting you in mandatory government schools, and by controlling, weaving messages into the media, whether that media is the kind of CNN, Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS, PBS, or whether that media is, a dozen internet companies, kind of new media companies that have been financed to consolidate their own industries, that are now kind of obviously censoring libertarian, voluntarist, conservative, constitutionalist voices. And so that goes back all throughout history, starting with in antiquity when in Italy and in Greece, they would send troops of traveling actors to perform plays in coliseums that still exist today all throughout kind of Europe. You can go to some of these outdoor amphitheaters where these troops of traveling acrobats would give the population a kind of template for why they get to be ruled, or to sell a policy of the day. But they would do it in fiction, they would do it in plays, and then as we moved on and we developed newspapers and then radio and then television, because they're stealing so much money, it's easy for them to kind of consolidate that media to have that ability to convince the population that it's legitimate. So that's, I wanted to just kind of, start off by saying that that's the foundation that I'm coming from. And then the original Etienne de la Boetie, as you mentioned, was a French political philosopher that wrote in the 16th century, where he was really the first to document the tools and the techniques that rulers used, not just to kind of rule them, but literally to kind of engender a fealty, a worship of the government class. And so where Machiavelli, so probably the best known is Machiavelli, which said, hey, look, there's these tools that you can use to rule the population. But Machiavelli was kind of pitching his way of ruling the population to the ruling elite, saying, hey, hire me and I'll show you how to run these slaves. Whereas Etienne de la Boetie was exposing it from a point of that this is illegitimate. They're using these tools and techniques to be able to trick the population into thinking that it's legitimate that they get to be ruled. And so that's the basis of the nom de plume. And now you've got kind of a little background of where I'm coming from.
Very good. And you kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago, but these techniques, they go back basically for centuries. Is that correct?
Oh, without a doubt. And so in the book, just in the American experience, this partnership between the ruling class and the media goes back to the founding of the Constitution, where you had a couple of dozen slave owners on a continent of 3 million people that got together in a room and wrote down on a fancy piece of paper, we're in charge, we get to make up rules for everybody, and we get to steal the wealth of others. And then they had the media proclaim that it was valid right out of the gate. But during the ratification debates in the individual states, there's massive evidence that the moneyed class that was looking to get a government that could tax and then pay off bonds issued in the Revolutionary War that they were buying for kind of pennies on the dollar, they were suppressing anti-federalist voices at the same time they were magnifying the federalist voices. So there's evidence that they tampered with the mail, and in New York, where they were kind of stealing anti-federalist writings out of the mail. In Pennsylvania, there's evidence that they bought off the transcriptionist during the ratification debates, so that he only transcribed speeches by Federalists and would not transcribe the speeches by anti-Federalists. And then there's a very famous incident where they took down a newspaper called the Pennsylvania Herald. It was really the only newspaper in Pennsylvania, which was a major kind of one of the key states that they needed to get ratification in. And they withdrew all of the subscriptions within their sphere of influence, collapsing the paper and ensuring that people weren't getting a true account of what was going on in these ratification debates. And so that partnership of that control perception, I track it through. That's how they got the Pledge of Allegiance and what came to be known as the Bellamy Salute, which came to be known as the Heil Hitler Salute. Many people don't know that the Nazis got it from us. That was a media creation. It was the most popular magazine of the time. It was called the Youth's Companion. And in 1892, they were pushing, so it was a media creation. They were pushing National Socialism, military socialism. They were getting this robotic chanting. They were getting taxation. You have to have government. You have to have socialism to control the people. And so they wanted to control the people. They wanted to get it in. And so they had a media company run by Freemasons that had a premium program that would give you an American flag when you got a subscription to the magazine. And then they began popularizing the Pledge of Allegiance and, like I said, what came to be known as the Bellamy Salute. Originally, it was a military salute. And you said, I pledge allegiance to the flag. And when you said the flag, you would go, oh, and you would extend your hand, you know, gracefully towards the flag. And then in 1907, they began popularizing on TV, because it's the media and the government working together, the kind of the Roman salute starting in 1907 in a movie called Ben-Hur. And then in 1919, the Italian fascists adopted it. In 1926, the Nazi Party in Germany adopted it. In 1944, the German military adopted it. In 1943, on Army Day, we switched from and by the way, so then over time, the kids just gave it up and they just stick their hands out like this. And so that's the way everybody did the Pledge of Allegiance. And then in 1943, when the crimes of the National Socialist Nazi Party in Germany became apparent, they had to abandon that and go to the hand over the heart, which they did. But these are some of the techniques. And if you're up for it, I can take you through kind of like 20 real quick, and you'll be able to see kind of like the historical pattern.
Definitely. Yeah, man, go for it.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to kind of take you through the book. And so, as I said, this is a photograph from the LA Times in 1943, right before the changeover, where you can kind of see screwed up. Hold on a second. Sorry. So you can actually see them doing the Bellamy salute. I actually believe that this photograph, because this was taken literally right before the changeover. And so they're doing kind of the old way of doing it with the hand up, up like, oh, to the flag. But I believe that this and a number of other photographs that the LA Times put forward was to kind of distance the pledge from what the Nazis were doing, saying, "Oh no, we don't do it like this. We do it like this. we're not Nazis. Nazis, they do it like this. We do it like this." And so, statism and this kind of control is just a matter kind of degree. But so the book. The book starts out, the first part of the book is really, I take a look at 20 different techniques that I use by intergenerational organized crime to create the culture of slavery and tax slavery, and I show how it manifested in each place. And so kind of in the, in the black section, it explains what the technique is, and then I show what it looks like in Nazi Germany, the US government, Soviet Union, and East Germany. And so the first one is, we're going to give the population an artificially indoctrinated holy symbol. And when I say holy symbol, the big trick is we're going to slide the population a pseudo-religion, but we're not going to tell them that it's a religion. We're just going to use all of the tools and the techniques of an unethically manipulative cult or religion. And because we're going to slide it to the people when they're young, they're really not going to kind of understand what's going on. But step number one is to give them this artificial holy symbol. They all have a social contract that nobody signed, but that everybody is expected to be a party to. After the social contract, really the number one is the mandatory government school running the Prussian model of education. The Prussian model education was developed in the 1800s when Prussia was losing on the battlefields of Europe. They came to the conclusion the reason they were losing was because soldiers would make kind of these individual decisions not to participate. You're drunk in a bar one night, you wake up and you're in the army, and you didn't have a lot of choices, so you stick around, you get your 3 squares a day, you play cards with your friends, but ultimately it comes time to get rolled out on a battlefield. Well, the soldiers, they didn't really have a dog in the fight. And so as soon as it got dangerous, they're like, hey, I'm out of here. I'm not going to, risk my life for this duke or earl or king or monarch or, whoever it was. And so The reason that the redcoats wore bright red jackets and the reason that the Hessians wore bright green coats is because they would go AWOL all the time because they didn't really have kind of like a dog in the fight. And so what the Prussians did is they were really the first to say, hey, we're going to take these kids before they're old enough to know better. We're going to put them in these mandatory government schools. We're going to raise them in the ideology of the state, and we're going to give them, a program that is part of it is the statism and the nationalism, and to convince you that you're not a free human being, you're not a earthling, you're a American or a Canadian or an Israeli because you were born on this side or that side of this imaginary line. And then we're going to raise you up in this ideology of the individual nation state. And the other component was really obedience, which is why you have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom, which is why you walk in single file lines, which is why they use, corporal punishment, why they use collective punishment in the schools, why they use public shaming, why they have the red, yellow, green troublemaker boards. And so, half of the hidden curriculum is nationalism and statism, and then half of it is obedience. There's also some debilitation in there. We're going to mandate that you have to have the mercury or aluminum laced vaccine to get into the schools that they know are causing neurological issues. But really, if you take a look at what is one of the key, tenets of the program, it's definitely the government school system. They all have a youth program to teach citizenship and blind obedience and state flag worship. So the program produces kind of two different kind of what I call tax slaves. And one is just kind of like your basic taxpayer that really believes in their heart that they owe money to these criminals and is tithing, because it's a kind of like the equivalent of tithing. And I'm a taxpayer, and I'm sure you've heard people's proud taxpayers that are glad to give their money to these criminals. But they learn that in the kind of the school. But the other part of the program is what's called the order follower. And the order follower is someone that is willing to take their individual morality and put it to the side and commit heinous crimes. They're willing to go abroad and murder people in wars of occupation or in wars based on, lies and manufactured intelligence. And the way they get the order followers, there's kind of like a little bit of a different track. And it starts with the youth program where kids now begin to get awards for how to salute the flag, how to caress the flag. We wear white gloves when we fold the flag up. We parade the flag in front of each other. We salute the flag. When the flag gets old, we don't just throw the flag away. We have to bury the flag. And all of that really starts with kind of the youth program. And I'm tracking that the companies at this day and kind of the modern age is the companies that are supporting, Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts here in America are the exact same companies that are benefiting from taking tax money stolen from the whole population and are filtering it into their own corporations. And so they're the ones that are supporting the program that enables the stealing and the redistribution to their back pockets. After the youth program, the basic youth program, then it gets creepy. And so a lot of people don't really know this, but kind of after, when you get to be an older Boy Scout, the Boy Scouts run a program called the Explorers, where now we're going to shave the kids' heads. Now we're going to put them in the uniform, the single form conformity. We're going to shave their heads. We're going to give them guns. We're going to start to teach them how to kill. We're going to teach them obedience to hierarchical command and control. We're going to give them, again, uniforms. It's JROTC. A lot of people don't know this, but the military, the Marine Corps is running dozens of high schools where the entire curriculum is the Marine Corps and obedience, and they've got 8 in Chicago alone. And so that's kind of like the next step to creating, an order follower. The military is really the next one. They all use pledges and oaths. So thousands and thousands of repetitions of this kind of like common prayer to the artificial holy symbol in both kind of the schools and in the youth program. They all artificially glorify the military and the police. And so every time in the book, you know, I'm going through the PDF version of the book, but every time you see like a hypertext link, you can click through and you can see kind of the scholarship behind the claim. But again, a lot of people don't realize when you see this propaganda at the stadium events, when you see the flag worship and the military worship, that the government is paying the NFL teams, the NHL teams, baseball. They're paying for the fighter jets to fly over the stadiums. They're paying for the ceremonies before the games. And that's really kind of, you know, an example that this is an artificial system. Okay, that what you're seeing, the reason that you're seeing is somebody is paying for you to see it because they want you to adopt and you know, this kind of pseudo religion into your worldview. So they're reinforcing it at the stadium events, and they're also reinforcing it in the propaganda, which we'll get to in a second. They all use political rallies, so they use spectacle, neuro-linguistic programming, speech techniques. They're using the artificial holy symbol, the flag, slogans, propagandas, and it's really they're creating something like a religious revival, in a kind of unethically manipulative way. They all use propaganda, so they conspire with the entertainment industry to really sell the population on nationalism and the legitimacy of the tax slavery system. Probably one of the other kind of key links in the book is this one right here. The CIA and Department of Defense have had direct involvement in 800 plus major movies and 1,000 television shows that we know about. So the DoD and the intelligence agencies, they frequently provide military equipment. Sometimes they provide funding. They often have script control where they can excise things or add things. And this is really the reason why, if you think about all the movies on especially Netflix, Amazon Prime, you know, that's why the government's always the hero, whether it's the FBI agent or the CIA agent saving the world from these terrorists that are everywhere, you know, just waiting to set off nukes in the United States, or, you know, all this, you know, fear propaganda that they're kind of selling to the population. They're also doing things like product placing the flag into movies. And I've got, you know, an example from the Michael Bay movies, where literally in 12 Michael Bay movies, there's almost 500 product placements of the American flag, where he just goes and clicks through, you know, 1 second for each, flag that he's throwing up on the screen. But not only are they kind of product placing in the flag, but they're also using a technique called anchoring. And anchoring is when the propagandist, the director, will build the audience up to this moment of kind of high positive emotion. If you've seen Matt Damon escaping Mars in the movie The Martian, there's this big buildup, you know, is he going to be able to make it off Mars? Oh no, something went wrong. He's not going to make it. Oh, he's going to make it. Yes, yeah, he's going to make it. Yes. And then boom, we cut back to Earth and everybody's waving American flags, and there's American flags on the back of the thing. And so they build you up to that moment of high exhilaration and high positive emotion, and they show you the flag. Next time you're watching a football game, they will score a touchdown and they'll cut to the flag. If you've seen the NBA has gone ahead and put the American flag right on the backboard, so that when you put it through the hoop, you see the American flag. And so you don't really notice it if you don't understand like what's going on. But once you kind of understand that, hey, this is a playbook, they're all kind of doing it, then it becomes kind of obvious that, like what's going on. They all use manufactured news, overt or surreptitious control of publishers, editors, and reporters to kind of create an artificial reality of what's going on. The CIA's control of the press was first exposed in kind of 1976 in something that was called the Church Committee hearings. And during the Church Committee hearings, under oath, the head of the CIA had to admit that they have hundreds, at that time, they had hundreds of reporters and publishers and editors on the CIA payroll, and that they were feeding propaganda into these various news outlets with hundreds of reporters that were on the CIA's payroll. I believe that program continues to this day. You take a look at some of the major people. Anderson Cooper on CNN is ex-CIA, is like one kind of prominent example. But the program appears to go on today, and they actually call internally they call it their ability to play the press the mighty Wurlitzer. And so we're controlling perception. We're going to give the population these templates and this kind of worldview because we control every screen and we deceive every audience. They all use manufactured terrorism. So this is a technique used throughout history to kind of unite the populations behind the government against these manufactured internal enemies. Sometimes it's domestic. If you click through, there's massive evidence that the government, the ATF and the FBI were behind the Oklahoma City bombing. Anybody that's got two neurons to rub together knows that the official story of 9/11 is physically impossible and somewhat ridiculous. And the FBI, the New York Times alone, has done articles where they've chronicled the fact that almost every single domestic terrorist incident has had an FBI agent provocateur providing the money, providing the explosives, and so almost all these, so all of the quote unquote domestic terrorism that you see is being engineered by the intelligence agencies to convince the population to be afraid and to keep giving us your money and we'll protect you. And they're just taking the money out the back door right into their pockets. They all use false flag events, manufactured intelligence and lies to start war. So the Gulf of Tonkin is one of the most famous incidents. The Kuwaiti babies tossed from incubators is another famous one. 9/11 enabled the global war on terror. So again, common technique. They all use political assassination of rivals, whistleblowers, and dissidents. And again, every time you kind of click through one of these links, you can see some of the best evidence for people ranging from Seth Rich, who was famously killed after providing the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, to John F. Kennedy, RFK, Martin Luther King are probably like some of the best known. They all have political temples dedicated to the state and the deities, and they bring middle school kids to Washington, D.C., generally in the spring, and they take them into the cathedral of the Capitol that's oversized to make you feel small and insignificant, and it looks like the Vatican for a reason because they're giving you this kind of pseudo-religion. They take you into the temples along the Potomac, Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. They show you the deities, and it's very solemn, and everyone inside is very reverent, and they're kind of slipping you on the sly this little, kind of pseudo-religion. They all use monopoly government fiat money that steals value secretly for the population. So the reason, the thing that enables them to buy up and consolidate the media is that in the United States, organized crime banks lobbied and bribed Congress in 1913 to create the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve Bank is a private bank, essentially funded by the money center banks, that stands behind the money center banks and allows them to engage in something called fractional reserve banking, where when you go get a car loan or a mortgage, they're not lending you other depositors' money. They just go, whee, bing, and they just create it with some strokes on a keyboard. And the more money that they create, it's stealing the value out of everyone else's money. So as the banks continue to create, trillions of quote unquote dollars, all these excess dollars begin to kind of bid up prices. And so it's not that the value of your house is going up or the value of your portfolio is going up. It's that it takes more dollars to buy the same amount of housing, the same amount of healthcare, the same amount of stocks, because they're stealing the value out of the money by allowing these banks to create these money to make these obscene profits. And really, that's why the bank is the biggest building in every city on the planet, is because they've kind of given themselves this exorbitant privilege to create money out of thin air and lend it interest, even though it's inflationary and it's stealing the value out of everybody else's money. And then they took all of their profits and they bought the media, so the media wouldn't tell you how you're getting ass raped by these criminal banks. They all spy on the citizens, which is how you know they're good people. They all use torture as policy, which is how you know they're good people. And not only is the torture kind of evidence that these are scum and what's known as kakistocracy, or ruled by the shit people, the absolute worst people possible, but it really is kind of evidence of this mind control program where after you go through the mandatory government school, scouting program, and the youth program, and JROTC, and Army training, that you are willing to do things that are immoral and cruel and obviously wrong. And that's, you have to be mind controlled to either to torture somebody, or frankly, if you support the government after you find out that your government is using torture, that's pretty evident that something's going wrong with you as a human being, and somebody taught you something that shouldn't be taught. Known torturer Gina Haspel currently heads the CIA. They all use secret prisons, for-profit prisons, concentration camps, and black sites. And so this is, in the United States, we're literally taking nonviolent people convicted of victimless crimes, where there's no crime, whether it's, smoking a plant or, prostitution, something where there's no victim, because society can't be a victim. And we're putting them in for-profit prisons and forcing them to work as slave labor for pennies an hour for these cartel companies that have been funded to consolidate their own industries. They all use conscription. They all use manufactured enemies to unite the population under the government. They all use paid political violence to their political oppositions. And that is really the first part of the book. And that not only, gives you the basics of some of the techniques, but it also lets people see the pattern, so that, human beings are really, really good pattern recognition machines. And once you kind of expose the pattern to them, then they're like, hey, wait a minute, that's a playbook. That's a pattern. They're doing that. They're running a playbook on me. And I have literally taken people just through the first part of the book, and they've had almost like, that moment of insight of realizing that, holy shit, the government's using the exact same program as the Nazis. The second part of the book, so now we're kind of in the middle part of the book, and I call these one-pagers. And a one-pager is kind of like a deep dive into a particular topic. You may or may not have noticed that the government is using religious symbolism in their propaganda. But if I stack 3 dozen examples, right next to each other, then all of a sudden the brain sees the pattern and goes, hey, wait a minute, they're doing that on purpose. And so again, it's a pseudo religion. It's a little kind of hidden religion, and they're using religious symbolism into the, in their propaganda. So the religion is called statism. And it is the indoctrinated belief in the necessity, the desirability, and the legitimacy of having a government at all. And there is no ironclad law in the universe that you have to have a government or that we need to have a government. But if you want to rob people and steal their money and control them and boss them around, you have to have government. And so we're going to give you this kind of religious indoctrination of why government is good, and we're going to kind of like slide it to you. And we're going to, we're not going to have it so that we have the artificial holy symbol of the flag, the holy documents, the Constitution. The president is kind of like the Pope, the father figure of the country, because human beings are kind of tribal instincts. So we're going to give them a artificial leader that we kind of, put in front of them. We're going to have them go to the mandatory church school. We're going to have them do the common prayer of the Pledge of Allegiance. We're going to have them sing hymns at stadium events, Star Spangled Banner. We're going to, and that's going to produce a citizen, which is going to pay his taxes, his tithe, and it's going to produce a kind of shave-headed cult member that's willing to go abroad and kill people in what are essentially crusades. The judges are going to wear robes, vestments, and they're going to sit on high. And you're going to walk into the courtroom, and everything's going to be oversized so that you feel kind of small and insignificant. And then the television's already told you that it's legitimate and how to behave when you're in the courtroom. And so most people will just emulate what they see on the TV and will, bow deferment to these criminals that are then, robbing them because they've given them a template that says, oh, this is how I'm supposed to behave in these certain situations, even though I haven't done anything, I haven't hurt anybody. There's no victim, but they're going to take me and they're going to put me away and they're going to, force me to work as slave labor. I do it in images, but then I also back it up with, I've got videos for people that like videos. I have books in PDF for people that are readers. And so I'm kind of stacking up kind of the best. I'm giving the reader kind of this executive summary template at the same time that I'm backing up all of the claims with kind of the best evidence of that kind of the best evidence and scholarship to the claims. We already kind of talked briefly about the shady history of the Constitution and how they hijacked, a convention only convened to amend the Articles of Confederation between the states. And after almost half of the delegates wouldn't participate, said, I smell a rat, left early, wouldn't sign, they produced an unauthorized replacement that gave the government the ability to tax the population. And as soon as that came online, they immediately began funneling that money, began taxing people and funneling the money into their pockets. Really, the first scam that the government did is the Revolutionary War government had issued bonds to both soldiers and to businesses that were selling them saltpeter, gunpowder, blankets, wagons, whatever the supplies that they needed were. But under the Articles of Confederation, there was no way for them to pay off these bonds. And so they began accumulating the bonds for pennies on the dollar, because it had been, decades since the Revolutionary War. Nobody really thought they were ever going to get paid. And so they began accumulating the bonds. Once they had the government online, the first thing that Hamilton did as Secretary of the Treasury was pay off these bonds at 100% on the dollar. And not only did they pay, so they were kind of accumulating them slowly before the government came online. But once it became clear that we were going to get this, that it was going to work, that their little scam was going to work, all of a sudden they sent riders, across the country. They sent sailing ships up and down the coast. We got to get these bonds. We're buying bonds because back then there wasn't instantaneous news, so they had this kind of information asymmetrical advantage where if they could go and scoop up all the bonds, then they're going to be in kind of like high cotton. The second thing they did was Hamilton paid off the debts of the individual states, and Thomas Jefferson questioned the validity of these debts and the amounts. And it's like, what's Hamilton doing paying these millions of dollars of to like Massachusetts? And so there's Jefferson didn't think that it was valid. I think it was valid. The final thing they did almost immediately coming online is they put a tax on whiskey that kind of targeted small distillers. It affected the small distillers more than it affected the big distillers like Washington. And so when the population said, we're not paying these taxes, Washington and Hamilton led an army of 13,000 into Pennsylvania to force compliance with the tax. And the Constitution and the Bill of Rights went right out the door 5 minutes after it was signed, before the ink was even dry. They searched homes without warrants. They took people out of the house, made them stand in the snow while they searched their homes. They made people sign, oaths of loyalty to the government. And then all of the people that were involved in the original Constitution, involved in the creation of this Constitution, they weren't the original founding fathers. A couple of them were, but it wasn't Jefferson, it wasn't Samuel Adams, it wasn't Patrick Henry. It was mostly lawyers and lobbyists that then personally enriched themselves by giving themselves salaries. They immediately put themselves all on the payroll. Washington famously billed, $500,000 worth of expenses to the government. So we're just going to steal everything from everybody. And then, we'll have our propaganda system, give the people these ridiculous ideas. George Washington cannot tell a lie, the cherry tree, these ridiculous myths, mythologies. So I explained how that works. I explained the shady history of the Pledge of Allegiance. We already talked, a little bit about how we did it. I mentioned that it was a media creation. So it's the government and the media working together. The building that you see here is the Youth's Companion building that was built in 1892 and still stands today in Boston. And that building is known locally in Boston as the Pledge of Allegiance building. And if you take a look at the size and scope of this building, imagine this building in 1892. That's the size and scope of the media operation run by Freemasons that got military socialism into the schools, that got the federal flag into the schools, they got the Pledge of Allegiance into the schools, they got the Bellamy Heil Hitler salute into the schools. And so I tell the story of that. If you actually want to see real video footage of American school children doing the Heil Hitler, Pledge of Allegiance, then there's some clips from this 1925 movie called The Vanishing American, which is really, really easy, really, really interesting, because not only does this movie show kids doing the Heil Hitler salute with the American flag, but also it's an Indian boarding school. And really, if you the first thing they did after they conquered the Indians is they took the Indians and they put them into the mandatory government school running the Prussian model of education. They were called Indian boarding schools. They separated them away from their parents, and they took the once proud and once free Indians and they turned them into taxpayers and order followers. And in this movie, they make a hero out of an Indian called Nephi, who was a tribal leader that was providing horses for the U.S. Army. So the hero is the Indian that is providing the horses for the military. You just can't make this shit up. It's just unbelievable. It goes back, this propaganda system literally goes back to the first, I think they invented radio and TV to propagandize the population. And it was the same tools and techniques that was used in Nazi Germany. When radio came out in Nazi Germany, they gave the population radios, but only radios that could receive stuff from Berlin. They made them underpowered so they couldn't get any information from the outside world, and they're controlling the information that people receive to give them this template that's legitimate, that you've got to give us this money, and really kind of selling the population on it. I get into the hidden curriculum of the government school system. Again, I've got books, I've got videos, I've got podcasts that will kind of take you deeper and bring you into kind of deeper understanding. But this picture right here is kind of powerful. This is a GROTC class, and this is really the real product of the government school system, is shave-headed cult members that are willing to go abroad and kill who they're told in wars of occupation armies, or wars based on lies and manufactured intelligence. And I don't like using the word shave-headed cult member. I say it with love. There's no other way. We can't sugarcoat it. I don't believe that we don't have the time to kind of beat around the bush. We don't have the time to sugarcoat it. They're training people to go and kill other people for them, and to set their morality on the sidelines and commit these heinous crimes. And the reason that the people do it is because they've been put through this program their entire life, and they've grown up in this propaganda system where they've been given these templates that it's legitimate, that they get ruled and they're supposed to do these things. I break down, we talked earlier about fractional reserve banking and how the banks are able to kind of create the money out of thin air. And I explain in more detail how the process works here. And then this is another visualization. It was a study in 2011 called the Network of Global Corporate Control. They analyzed 37 million companies, 43,000 transnational corporations, and they built a model of who owns what, and discovered that just about 147 companies control 40% of global wealth. And so if you're giving banks the ability to create money out of thin air, they're buying up they're buying up everything on the monopoly board. It's imagine if you're playing Monopoly and the banker is cheating and he's reaching under the table and he's grabbing $500 bills. At the end of the game, who owns every single thing on the board, and who are renters and debtors? And so that's really what's going on. They started with the press, so the press wouldn't tell you about it. But now we're just going to consolidate everything. That's all these private equity deals where private equity and hedge funds are scooping up real plant, property, and equipment. They're taking little paper tickets that they either print on a printing press or create, electronically, and they're buying the world with their little paper tickets and waging a kind of economic warfare on the individual businesses, small mom and pop restaurants with chain stores and chain restaurants, and we're going to run the independent business people out of business because we don't want independent wealth competing with us. We don't want the population to be capitalized to do anything about it. We want to keep them poor, and so we're going to keep them poor by stealing half their income in taxes, state taxes, inflation. It's Grand Theft USA. So we talked about how they mentioned how they control the media. This is a media ownership chart that was done in 2006, but it's kind of just as relevant today. And I'll show you the entire chart before we go back and take a look at it. But every time you see kind of one of these things, I mentioned earlier that there's 6 companies controlling hundreds and hundreds of subsidiaries to give the population the illusion of choice and the illusion of the illusion of choice and the illusion of, hold on a second, are you getting the screen share now?
Yes, I have it here.
Okay, so they're giving the population the illusion of choice and the illusion of diversity of opinion. But the reality is that these companies are operating as a cartel, and they're controlling kind of the reality that people receive in a way that is kind of unethically manipulative. I've got a quote here. I've got a couple of quotes, one from CIA Director William Colby, where he says the CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media. And then right under that, I've got a quote that comes out of a CIA deception handbook called Deception Maxims, Fact and Folklore, where they say deception becomes more difficult as the number of channels of information available to the target increases. However, within limits, the greater number of controlled channels, the greater the likelihood the deception will be believed. So that's the reason why there's 500 channels on TV. If it was between like one channel showing nothing but truth and one channel showing nothing but deception, it would be easy for people to determine what is truth and what is deception. But if there's 500 channels of deception and one or no channels of truth, and you grow up in that milieu, Plato has the allegory of the cave where there's, prisoners that are trapped in a cave, and behind the prisoners there's a fire, and in between the fire and the prisoners a walkway, and these puppeteers go back and forth, and that shadow play becomes their reality. And if all you know is the shadow play, then even if one of the prisoners escapes and he goes outside of the cave and he sees the real world and he sees the sun and he sees the people and everything, and he goes back and he tries to explain the reality to his fellow captives, they're not going to believe him because all they've ever known is the shadow play. And so that's really the position that we're at, is people have grown up in this propaganda system, not understanding that it's a propaganda system, and so they're more likely to kind of like fall for the big con. The chart that I showed you a second ago shows how they've bought up the physical assets of the media. They own the radio stations. They own the news stations. They own the television stations. They own the satellite networks. They own the theme parks. They own the movie chains. They own all of that, but it doesn't explain how they're able to exercise control over hundreds of publications. This is another visualization called The American Empire and Its Media. It was done in 2017 by Swiss Propaganda Research, where you can see that three organizations, because if you want to rob the world, you have to have meetings. And so the three organizations, the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission, have maneuvered their membership into the key reporter positions, editorships, publisherships at all of these major populations. And so this is how they're able to exercise control over dozens and dozens of publications and get everybody on kind of like the same page, whether the same page is selling the next war of aggression or or the bailouts or whatever they're trying to sell to the population. These organizations are how they're able to give the marching orders to hundreds of members of the media to keep everybody kind of like on the same page. This one I call Organized Crimes, Front Groups, and Secret Societies, where I actually break down who is the Council on Foreign Relations, who is the Bilderberg Group, who is the Trilateral Commission. I also cover Freemasonry, Skull and Bones, Bohemian Grove, and some others. And the visualization on the back is a visualization that was done in 2010 by the Fund to Restore an Educated Electorate, where they took a look at the same three organizations, and they tracked them going back in time. So we'll just take a look at the presidents as an example. So Barack Hussein Obama was Bilderberg. Before Obama, there was Clinton, who was Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Before Clinton, there was George Herbert Walker Bush, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. For him, there was Carter, who was Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. For Carter, there was Ford, who was Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations, and a 33-degree Freemason. And so what you're seeing is this pattern, not just in the presidency, but in the vice presidency, the cabinet, special assistants to the president, presidential candidates, the Federal Reserve System, Export-Import Bank, Council on Economic Advisors, Central Intelligence Agency, Joint Chiefs of Staff, money center banks, the media. And so what you're able to see here is you're able to see, going back decades, in every major political power center in the United States, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, it's the exact same people running the show each and every time. So let's back out. So then this one's called Consumer Monopoly Consolidation. And so now we're going to give, so part of the program is the statism and the nationalism, but part of it is we're going to debilitate the population so they can't think straight, and so they don't understand how they're getting robbed. And that debilitation program was described by Bertrand Russell in 1953, writing in a book called The Impact of Science on Society, where he said, diet, injections, and injunctions, injunctions is schooling, will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Even if they are all miserable, all will believe themselves happy because the government will tell them that they are so. And so that diet, injection, and injunction program, we already covered the injunctions, the mandatory government school running the Prussian model of education. But on the diet side, what we've got is we have a handful of monopoly corporations that are being financed with essentially unlimited capital that the bankers create out of thin air to buy up and consolidate their own industries. And so if you take a look at who is putting garbage in the food supply, whether that garbage is excessive sugar, aspartame, BPA, BPS in the cans, recombinant bovine growth hormone in the dairy, artificial food colorings, glyphosate, which has been linked to cancer, is the main ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup, fluoridated water, glutamates, refined grain, genetically modified ingredients. These monopoly companies finance to consolidate their industry. That's who's putting garbage into the food supply. And then on the back of this particular visualization is testing results. And so if you take a look at glyphosate alone, which is the main ingredient in Roundup, these are military companies. These are companies that make poisons for the military. So Monsanto made Agent Orange in Vietnam, it's Dow, it's DuPont, it's Bayer. All of these are military contractors. They're putting chemicals and toxins in the food supply, and you can see independent third-party testing results that show you kind of the amount of glyphosate in some of these products, many of which are targeted towards kids. And so like you take a look at Cheerios is kind of like got the biggest dose in it. And so we're going to put harmful things in the food supply so that they can't think straight. The final leg, the third leg, diet, injections, and injunctions. It's the injections. That is the mercury and aluminum placed vaccines that have been linked to neurological issues. And so there's a debilitation program in addition to kind of like the control program. People are now avoiding the food. So now people know that, you know, corporate food is garbage food. So now we're going to avoid it. So now we're going to genetically modify the organisms in ways that are harmful to the population as well. And so this is, you know, this rat right here was one of the rats in a study by Giles Seralini of the University of Caen, where they fed rats Roundup Ready corn and Roundup glyphosate-based herbicide, and they found that the rats that ingested these genetically modified corn and glyphosate produced enormous tumors. They died before other rats, and then the paper was published in a peer-reviewed paper in the journal Food and Chemical Toxicology. Monsanto got one of their quote-unquote ex-employees onto the editorial board, and then they retracted the study, which is an example of, again, this control of perception program. We're going to hide the things from you that we don't want you to see, while we magnify the things that we do want you to see. Right after they pulled the study, 4 different other peer-reviewed journals said, we see what's going on here, we'll republish the study, and they republished the study. In addition to, and so this is another visualization. This one was done by Dr. Philip Howard, a professor at MSU studying the global food system. And so this is only half of it, but they're consolidating the seed companies. Monsanto's on the left, Bayer is on the right. They have now merged. If you can see the rest of this visualization, you've got Dow and DuPont down below, and they've bought around 200 seed companies. So they're making a play to control the seed supply so that you can only get genetically modified seeds and garbage in a classic military tactic to control the food population. Who's doing it? Companies that make poisons for the military. Keep going here. So I mentioned I'm a voluntarist, which is kind of a rebrand of anarchy. Anarchy is the kind of the biggest secret that's kept from the population. Anarchy doesn't mean no rules. Anarchy means no rulers. But because the rulers don't want you to know that there's an option on the menu called no rulers, they've used their media and propaganda system to literally change the meaning of the word no rulers to mean chaos and dystopia and kind of Mad Max, Mad Max chaos. And they even use the dictionary as a weapon. And so to kind of show the reader how the definition of anarchy was changed from no rulers to chaos and dystopia, I compare the 1828 definition of anarchy from Webster's dictionary with the current Merriam-Webster online dictionary. And it was kind of funny when I went to get the screenshot from what the current the definition of anarchy is on Merriam-Webster. They're promoting, in the #1 spot where you can promote a word, they're promoting socialism. So we're going to change the meaning of anarchy to be something that's utopian and that prevailed in the ghetto, but their definition of democratic socialism laughably claims that it would ensure economic growth and a fair distribution of income. And it's just ridiculous. Technically, any kind of socialism only achieves redistribution at the point of a gun. And who decides what's fair? The bankers and the Council on Foreign Relations members that control the dictionary. And by the way, guess who owns the dictionary? It's the Safra banking family. And guess who sits on the editorial board of directors? The former president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So again, you're able to kind of see the pattern of this control of perception, whether it's control of the Encyclopedia Britannica in the dictionary, whether it's control of the television stations and the radio stations, the name of the game, the most powerful weapon in the entire U.S. arsenal is control of perception. That's really it. I get into false flag terrorism for war and domestic police state. I break down some of these hoax events and false flag events that are being used to push for gun control or to push for repeal of posse comitatus, repeal of habeas corpus, military tribunals, like they've stolen our rights under this war on terror, and they're using these hoax events and manufactured terrorists to do it. I've got a one-pager for the police and the judges that explains the criminality of what they're involved in. And then I've got confessions and quotes from the criminals themselves. So, like, well, surely if there was a conspiracy this vast, then someone would have talked. Well, I've got 2 or 3 presidents. I've got a couple of British prime ministers. I've got some of the criminals themselves with verified quotes, essentially confirming, what I'm saying. And then really the rest of the book is kind of meme war. And so I've got memes, explaining natural law and the illegitimacy of government and voluntarism. But I've also got, just completely mocking the ridiculousness, the illogic, and the immorality of government and democracy. I've got, the ridiculousness of voting, the mandatory government schools, the voting for status, and obviously rigged elections when half the population doesn't even vote, the ridiculousness of not understanding that both parties are owned and controlled by the same interests, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So if you really take a look at the Republicans and the Democrats, they are 100% lockstep. Everything that is important to the ruling class, they're lockstep on. Fiat paper tickets manufactured by banks, unconstitutional wars, torture, bailouts, the TARP, the TOLF, they're both funded by Goldman Sachs. And so they just split the population into these 2 large democratic camps where they play them off against each other in a kind of divide and conquer system, even though at the end of the day, all the policies never change, the tax rate never changes, nothing really ever changes, because everything that you see on TV is kind of just a play. It's like it's a TV show where we're going to control both sides in a kind of like mob horse race where we're going to give you 2 choices and we own both choices. It's like and the bought and paid for media is going to cover it kind of like the announcers at a worldwide wrestling match. We'll cover every verbal suplex and pile driver, but we're not going to tell you that the game is rigged, and we're not going to tell you that the McMahons own both wrestlers. And so it is 100. Now we're down to actors and reality TV stars, and we've got this season. We got people aren't paying attention, so we've got this reality star that says the most zany, crazy things just to get people to pay attention to what's going on, and it's just sad and pathetic. I break down the police. I break down the immorality and the ridiculousness of the statist military, the sadness of middle slavery, arguments against it. And then the rest of this is really solutions. And so the final part of the book is explaining kind of what the solutions are that kind of get us out of this, and giving you some kind of alternative news sources that will help you. And so the main other 2 things that I know we're getting kind of short on time, so the main other 2 things that I want to kind of cover is, so the book is part of a larger effort of something that I call the Art of Liberty Foundation. And the Art of Liberty Foundation is a startup public policy organization that I founded, kind of a think tank. And the goal is to study our quote unquote political problems, not really as kind of political problems, but as, hey, this is an intergenerational organized crime system. They're controlling, perception, they're controlling the media, and then producing kind of scholarly, well-researched, well-referenced work explaining kind of in even more greater detail than I go into, in the book, of how the system works from a principled, voluntarist, libertarian standpoint of it's illegitimate from the face that one group of people gets to rob and control another group of people. And so part of the work that that want to do is explaining the propaganda system and the logic and illegitimacy of government. But also I want to study how do we transition from this organized crime government system to voluntary societies where you don't necessarily have monopoly police, but you have private protection companies. If ADT is rude to you, you can go to West Tech. You don't have monopoly government courts. You have arbitration. Essentially, the market can provide everything that monopoly government does that is non-redistributive. So, of course, there's going to be roads. Of course, there's going to be, armed protective services. Of course, there's going to be these things that people want in society. But instead of a monopoly provider that forces you to pay at the barrel of a gun, you, the consumer, sit in the driver's seat, and the police only would protect life, liberty, and property. They're not going to be putting people in for-profit prisons for victimless crimes. They're not going to be SWAT teaming people for plants. They're not going to be doing road piracy and robbing people on the highways and the byways. They would only act to protect life, liberty, and property, which is an extension of your rights as a human being. And because you have the right to protect your life, liberty, and property, you can deputize or delegate a night watchman to exercise rights that you have. And so that is moral and logical versus this idea that a small number of people get to use violence on the rest of society and force everybody to pay money and use their rapidly depreciating fiat paper tickets. That's all BS. And so that's the Art of Liberty Foundation. And then the final thing I really want to share with the audience is how do we win the whole thing? So if we're in a system where they're controlling perception, they're controlling the television stations and the radio stations, and how do we get around that control of the media and control of Google, Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia, Discuss, Meetup, Reddit. There's about a dozen kind of new media companies that have also been funded with unlimited capital. The DARPA had the internet. I'm an ex-networking guy. I've seen network maps of before it was DARPA, the ARPA internet from 1973 and 1974, where they had hundreds of different institutions, research institutions, military bases connected to the internet in the early 70s. They had the internet a decade before we did. They knew that it was going to be important to control books and retail and search and social media. And so what appears to have happened is they funded the same way they've funded these companies to buy up their competition in the food and consumer products arena. They have funded these major internet properties to control perception on the DARPA internet. So how do you get away from it? And so I'm a member of something called the Free State Project. I just moved to New Hampshire. The Free State Project is an effort by libertarians and voluntarists to concentrate our numbers into one state with a low population where 20,000 people could have an impact on the political process. And that got started in kind of 2003 when they picked New Hampshire as as kind of the most likely state. It has a low population. It's relatively small in size, so you can canvass it easily. It has a history of liberty, has a small percentage of population that's dependent upon government, federal or state government dollars. They've got the most kind of wide open legislature in the country. So the place that we can win, if we can win one place, then I think we can win everywhere. And that one place to win is New Hampshire. And so the Free State Project is working on getting 20,000 plus libertarians to move here. 24,000 have signed a statement of intent saying that they will move to New Hampshire within 5 years of the total membership of the group hitting 20,000. But in 2003, when they picked New Hampshire, people started moving immediately. They're called kind of early movers. And so for over a decade, they've been building the social and political networks in the state needed to affect social change. They've elected 45 plus libertarians into the legislature. There's 25 serving right now. There's about 5,000 free staters on the ground. There's 24,000 that have pledged to move. They hit the 20,000 number in 2016. Last year, 1,300 new people signed up knowing they would have to move within 5 years. And so what's going on here on the ground in New Hampshire is very, very exciting. People are arriving every single week, every part of the state. They're getting involved in political activism. They're running for office. They're putting little mini libraries of liberty into laundromats. They're working, some of them are working on secession. Some of them are working on tracking the bills that go before the legislature. It's an amazing thing. And so what I want to do is supercharge that by widely exposing the criminality and the illegitimacy of government. And so how do you get around the censorship? How do you get around the control of the media? It's got to be hard copy books. And in addition to the book, I have a flash drive that we call the Liberator. And it has 8 gig of evidence that backs up everything that we just went through. It's got documentaries, it's got books in PDF, it's got podcasts, it's got truth music, it's got dank liberty memes. Half of it is exposing the criminality of the government, whether it's trillions of dollars handed to private banks and companies through the TARP and the TALF and the bailouts, whether it's the $10 trillion the Pentagon is missing, whether it's the Pentagon's secret Bishop Fund, slush fund, whether it's 6.6 billion that can't be accounted for out of physical cash they flew into Afghanistan and then lost 6.6 billion, whether it's the actuarial impossibility of Social Security. Half of what's on the drive exposes the criminality of the government, and then half of the drive explains libertarianism, voluntarism, how the market would provide armed protection, how it would provide prisons, how it would provide courts without there being monopoly government. But the free market and real charity could provide everything that the government does. And if the government wasn't stealing the value out of the money, if the government wasn't stealing half of your income, we would all be fabulously, fabulously wealthy if the government wasn't running the debilitation program. And so really, I'm trying to study how we can make this transition. But the main thing is the goal with the Pre-State Project is to drop 100,000 copies of the book, the flash drive, and a DVD of Vaxxed, which exposes the debilitation program that the CDC has known that these vaccines are causing neurological issues since at least 2000. We've got a whistleblower in the CDC. He's naming names. They all the doctors that have told you that the vaccines are safe, the reason they believe it is because the CDC has been lying to them. We've known that for years, but now finally we have a whistleblower that has explained how the scam works. And so because the media won't cover that, we've got to go out there and we've got to do it hand to hand. And we've got to do it in one state that already has this concentration of liberty activists, this history of liberty, live free or die. And for about $1 million, we could hit 100,000 households of high school juniors and seniors where we're getting at least 3 people, which is about 1/3 of the voting population in the state. And the goal is to achieve something that is known as kind of the 100th monkey effect. And the 100th monkey effect is when enough of the population kind of come inside on an idea where they just go, oh, well, of course. And so that's kind of the goal. That's what I'm working on. And we sell the book online. If you want to understand our slavery, you go to understandingourslavery.com. I recommend getting the book in kind of hard copy, because if you want to wake somebody up, it really needs to, hard copy is it's impossible to delete. It's easy on the eye. You can read it at night. You really want, it's a complex subject, so you really want people to spend time with it. And then we also sell the Liberator flash drive. It's $25 for the book. It's $15 for the flash drive. You can get them both for $35. And it's not, and I know a lot of your audience kind of already knows about these, but really the book isn't designed for the choir. The book is designed to be a tool, the most effective tool available to take somebody that is either has never heard this information before or is just vaguely familiar, and to take them from 0 to 60 in a kind of scientifically designed publication that is tailored towards the 65% of the population that are visual learners. The visualizations make what was invisible visible. So now you can actually see, oh, that's the hidden government. When you say the deep state, oh, that's the deep state. When you say fake news, that's the fake news. Oh, those are the organizations that are putting the fake news out. And so I'm making this visible. I'm exposing the historical pattern. And it's been very, very well received. I've now kind of done over like a dozen interviews. Every place that you can either read the book or you can see one of the interviews, 98% has been overwhelmingly positive. And the book has been fact checked. We've had a professional editor and a fact checker, and nobody has seriously found kind of any fault in it. But we continue to improve it. And it's crowdsourced, so if you see anything that needs to be corrected, let me know. But this is what I'm trying to do, and the goal is to free New Hampshire, create a laboratory of liberty to be able to show how we can transition from these organized crime monopoly government to voluntary societies where everything that the government provided as monopoly is provided in a competitive marketplace where the consumer is in charge, where you get to decide and you have the ability to say no, versus right now everybody's got a gun to their head where if you don't pay the taxes, if you don't, kowtow, everybody knows what's going on. And so that's what I'm up to.
That is excellent information. And if people, hear this and they don't have an eyebrow raised and, they aren't going out and following up on this information, then, they're more brain dead than they realize. This is fantastic information. Like you said, it's all there in black and white. I want to thank you so much for sharing this with everybody. I had so many questions for you, but I know we're out of time, so I'm going to have you back on because I want to pick your brain a little bit. And yeah, man, that was fantastic, and I'll definitely have to have you back on.
Hey, definitely. Next time we'll go freestyle. I thought this was important to kind of give the audience kind of the basics and the overview. But I would welcome the opportunity to do it again, or we can kind of, like go freestyle and get into, anything that you want to get into. So I'll make myself available whenever you are.
Awesome, man. Sounds great. And you have an excellent night.
Thanks. And again, final thing, if you want to understand our slavery, you got to go to understandingourslavery.com, and you can find, if you go to the tab for the Art of Liberty Foundation, you can get our executive summary for the Art of Liberty Foundation and the Pre-State Project. And I would encourage everybody that's listening that is interested in liberty, come on to New Hampshire. The water's fine. People are great, and we're making massive societal and cultural change in the state, and that's only going to accelerate as more and more people arrive every single week. It is fantastic what's going on here. Come on and join the party.
Sounds awesome, and I'm going to leave a link to that website in our description. And again, thank you so much, and you have an awesome night.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.